I welcome you all to this 9th webinar of INAE Mumbai chapter. This has been organized to celebrate INAE Foundation Day. This Foundation Day has already been centrally observed on 20th by Central Office, and all chapters are celebrating it till 25th of this month. Special welcome to our speaker, Professor Varun Vallerao, a very young, dynamic faculty of IIT Mumbai. I know at this moment, Mumbai, especially even India also, we all are searching for oxygen, and production of oxygen has already increased. But along with oxygen, we need some mental boosters also. And Professor Vallerao's lecture, I'm sure that will act as the same and it will refresh us. So welcome, Professor Vallerao. We have with us Professor Suresh, Professor of IIT Mumbai. He is also a very well-known person here because he has conducted many more webinars. So without wasting any of our time, I request Professor Suresh to take over the session for further proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roy. Good afternoon all, and welcome to this webinar, which, as Dr. Roy mentioned, is being organized by the Mumbai chapter of the INAE to celebrate the Foundation Day of the Academy. INAE was founded on 20th of April 1987 and therefore stepped into its 35th year 3 days ago. Every year there are events held around the 20th of April to celebrate the foundation of the Academy and to rededicate ourselves as the body of fellows to the mission of the Academy. Arguably, engineering and technology are among the foremost drivers of development of a country, and the Indian National Academy of Engineering, as the sole engineering academy in the country, is a forum that promotes this activity in its endeavor to provide solutions to the country's problems, as well as in harnessing engineering and technology for futuristic developments. INAE counts among its fellowship India's most distinguished engineers, technologists, and engineering scientists. In addition, there is also a select band of foreign fellows. The fellowship spans the entire gamut of engineering disciplines. Among its objectives, the Academy aims to provide definitive policy inputs in areas of technology to the government. It also has in its sights the continuous encouragement and development of engineering R&D and manpower, and facilitation of a continuous and constructive dialogue between industry and the academia. The various activities of the Academy are thus oriented towards these objectives. On the occasion of the Foundation Day, we recall to ourselves the raison d'etre of the Academy and pledge to do our bit in furthering its objectives. Coming to today's webinar and the speaker, Professor Varun Vallerao is the speaker of the day. He's an astrophysicist at IIT Bombay and works in the area of astrophysical instrumentation and observational astrophysics. By training, he is a BTech in electrical engineering from IIT Bombay, which he followed up with a PhD from Caltech in 2012. During his doctoral work, he worked on NuSTAR, the first focusing hard X-ray telescope, which is a Caltech JPL NASA mission. He also studied high mass X-ray binaries with optical and infrared telescopes to measure neutron star masses. As a Vaidya Rai Chaudhary Prize postdoctoral fellow at Ayuka, Pune, after his PhD, he led the ground calibration of the cadmium zinc telluride imager on AstroSat, which is the Indian Multi-Wavelength Space Telescope. At IIT Bombay, he and his group work on the development of Growth India, which is India's first fully robotic telescope. The group leads the Indian effort in the study of elusive electromagnetic counterparts to gravitational wave sources. Dr. Bhale Rao is the principal investigator for the proposed Daksha mission, which is a highly ambitious space telescope that aims to detect explosive astrophysical events in space. Daksha will be the most sensitive telescope ever built for the study of such events. Varun Bhale Rao is a recipient of the Vainu Bappu Gold Medal, which is the highest honor given by the Astronomical Society of India. He is also an associate of the Indian Academy of Sciences and a recipient of the DST Inspire Faculty Fellowship. He has been awarded the IIT Bombay Early Research Achiever Award in 2019 and the Kriti Ramamritam Award for Creative Engineering also in 2019. He has published more than 50 refereed publications and more than 400 astrophysics circulars. More information about Professor Bhale Rao's research can be found on the website of the Space Technology and Astrophysics Research Laboratory of IIT Bombay, for which the link is provided on the slide that you are seeing on your screen right now. With that, before I hand over to Professor Bhale Rao, a couple of housekeeping announcements. You will be muted during the entire course of the webinar, and so please stay muted. Any questions you have can be posted in the question and answer box. At the bottom of your WebEx window, you will see 3 dots on the right hand end, the ellipses. If you click on that, the question and answer box opens up, and you can post your questions there. That is the best method so that your question will not be missed. I will take these questions at the end of the webinar, at which point, if necessary, you can also come online and ask your question. With that, I will hand over to Professor Bhale Rao for delivering the webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh, for the great introduction, and thank you to INAE for inviting me to give this webinar. So I'm Varun Bhale Rao. I've worked on a couple of space missions, and it's very different when we are thinking of space as compared to when we are thinking about things that we do on the ground. So that's the journey I want to take you on today. Now, I started off as an engineer and then switched into sciences again and became an astrophysicist. So I had a choice. I would either be an astronomer who also does engineering or an engineer who also does astrophysics. And today I'm here as an astronomer who also does engineering. So I'm going to take you through this journey today, where I'll try to cover 3 main points. First is, of course, why do you want to put a telescope in space? When I was a student, the answer was quite obvious. That's way cooler than putting a telescope on the ground. Now I have to think of it a bit differently because it's also far more difficult to put a telescope there. And then I'll talk about some Indian space telescopes, and then lastly go through some interesting engineering aspects that we have to worry about when we are designing for space. So let's start with why do we observe from space? Well, the entire tomb of astronomy is that we are a physical science. We want to observe things, and we have to study everything on the basis of that. So the point there is that we can look at things, but dekho magar dur se. We cannot actually go close to anything. We cannot touch it. We cannot examine it. If I'm trying to study how the Big Bang happened, I can't quite take a test tube, mix in some chemicals, and start another universe. So in that sense, we are very away from, or we are very different in terms of our methodologies as compared to other physical sciences. And that means that we have to be very, very, very good at how we observe things. To continue the chemistry example, it's as if you are standing outside your college's chemistry laboratory, looking in through the window, and you have been asked to tell, okay, wo test tube dikh raha hai, what kind of chemical reaction is actually going on in there? Can you tell us the composition, masses, how hot is it, and things like that. So in order to accomplish something like this, we want to use everything that we can. And we actually observe not just in optical, but in the entire electromagnetic spectrum with modern telescopes. So why do we actually want to observe in many wavelengths? And that's because each wavelength gives us a new perspective. Okay, here's one example. The image on the left and right are the same image. I am standing on the left holding a digicam in my hand. taking a picture. And in this picture, you can actually see that I'm wearing a red cap, there's someone wearing a hat behind me, and so on. Whereas on the right side is an infrared image of the same thing. And this image looks quite different. So you can see that my cap is significantly cooler. And here, while you don't see the wearer's face, on the right side, it is quite clear that where his hat is touching his head, there are hot spots. On the other hand, you can see the glasses of this lady are actually quite cool in the literal sense of the term. They are literally cooler than the rest of her body. So by examining the infrared, we get an idea of what we broadly call heat vision. And it is things like this. Or another example is when we go to a hospital, if we have an X-ray taken, then that is allowing the doctor a different perspective into our body. It is allowing her or him to understand things that are happening with our bones, which would not otherwise be visible, thankfully. So here's another example. Okay, what I'm going to show you now is this is a very nice picture of the Milky Way galaxy. Something that we almost came close to seeing from Mumbai last year when there was a complete lockdown. But otherwise, you have to go to a really dark site to see something as beautiful as this. And this picture, of course, is taken from the ground using optical cameras. So this is similar to what our eyes would see at a really good site. What I'll show you next is images taken in two different infrared wavelengths and in X-rays. So here is an image that is taken in near and far infrared. And now what you see here is an X-ray image. And when you put all of that together, you notice that what is seen as a bright spot in X-rays is actually very faint in red, which is infrared. Both yellow and red colors here are infrared. So you see all kinds of structures here. What you are seeing in this particular shot, for instance, is cocoons of dust and gas that were formed around star, whereas here you are seeing a highly energetic object that is actually emitting X-rays. So each little thing that you see here is different, and each wavelength is giving you a different perspective. And not only that, this image, the whole thing that you're seeing looks so very different from what we saw in optical. So the point is that to understand everything that we can about these sources, we have to go and look at all possible wavelengths. Now this video here zoomed and panned around the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And at the center of the Milky Way galaxy lies probably the most exotic and most popular of all astrophysical objects, which is a supermassive black hole. Now, these black holes, of course, are black. They don't emit anything. But as stuff falls into the black hole, it starts emitting gigantic amounts of radiation, primarily in X-rays. Now, what is shown here is the opacity of the atmosphere. And what you see on the left is short wavelength. So this would be gamma rays over here, followed by X-rays. And fortunately, the atmosphere blocks all of that. The sun is actually quite a copious emitter of X-rays. And fortunately, the atmosphere protects us, which is how life could evolve on Earth in the first place. Otherwise, the rate of mutation would have been way too high. The atmosphere is also protecting us from getting cancer from exposure to that. Visible light comes down to the ground, not 100% of it. Some light is absorbed by the atmosphere. We see the sky is blue. So clearly some of the blue light was taken out from the sunlight that was coming in. There are some visible bands or some transparent bands, sorry, in infrared. And then in radio, there is a large window which is transparent. But if you want to study far infrared radiation, if you want to study very long wavelength radio, okay, so very long, we are talking about wavelengths which are of the orders of kilometers. So we are talking at very, very low frequency radiation over here. Or if you want to study X-rays and ultraviolet and gamma rays, you actually have to be outside the atmosphere. What will we see by going there? Let's look at a few objects. This, as I said, is of course everybody's favorite. This is a movie clip taken from the movie Interstellar. A curious thing about this movie, by the way, the black hole rendering that you see here is actually a scientifically accurate rendering. So Christopher Nolan actually hired Professor Kip Thorne from Caltech as a consultant for this movie. And they paid for a bunch of supercomputers to be set up to simulate what a black hole would look like. And they actually used that. So the resultant simulations on one side were published in a scientific journal, and on the other side made it into really cool special effects of the movie. Other than that, the movie has a really bad plot. Okay, the movie starts by saying there's no food on Earth. Then the hero goes and finds how gravity works and how black holes work, and everyone lives happily ever after. I have no idea. I mean, Govinda's movies have better plots than this. But that apart, black holes, this area around the black hole that you see, okay, this entire disk over here, this is the part which is interesting because as matter is falling into a black hole, it starts moving at relativistic speeds. And a simplistic way to look at it is I have something falling from this direction, something else coming in from here. When they collide, all of that kinetic energy will get converted to heat. So these areas, and these are called accretion disks, these disks can actually get heated up to millions of degrees, and they will emit in X-rays. So if you want to study black holes, one way you can do it is you could study them in radio from the ground. These areas also emit radiation. You may have seen the famous image of a black hole or of a black hole that was released here. Better way to study them is to actually go into space. Here's what my own research focuses on. This is neutrons that are orbiting each other. So let me pause here for a moment. Neutrons are which is 1.5 to 2 times heavier than the sun, but it is smaller than the speed of the diameter of a star is around 20 to 30
Hello?
kilometers. Okay.
Varun, your presentation seems frozen.
Am I audible? Am I? Yes,
Yeah,
I have actually paused it.
Audible? Yeah. Okay.
I have actually paused the animation. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, go
So,
ahead.
neutron star, as the name suggests, is actually made almost entirely of neutrons. So you have a neutron star is so heavy that about a spoonful of it would weigh about as much as Mount Everest. And what we are showing here, the animation which I'll start again soon, is two neutron stars that are orbiting each other. And as per predictions by Einstein's theory of relativity, as they orbit around each other, they actually emit gravitational waves. And this is an artist's rendering of an event which we saw about 3.5 years ago on 17th of August 2017. So here is what happens. We have these two neutron stars. They are orbiting each other. The blue waves are depicting gravitational waves. They are not light waves. They are a completely different form of radiation. And as they emit gravitational waves, these neutron stars come together and collide. And then there's a massive explosion. There's a lot of matter thrown out around the equator. It launched two massive jets along the poles. This material then traveled for many, many light years, interacted with interstellar medium. And all of this was observed by hundreds of telescopes around the world. The final paper that we published on this was, of course, the primary detection from LIGO, plus all of these follow-up attempts, the largest astronomical campaign ever done. And this paper had about 3,500 co-authors. Okay, because everybody was looking forward to this event and everybody got together to study this event. So now this is the study of electromagnetic counterparts. So we studied this in optical, in X-ray, in radio, using all the telescopes at our disposal, two gravitational sources. So that is my main area of interest. And even here, as an example, let me show you how this looks like from the ground and how it looks like from space. So here are the first 6 events that spotted this, first 6 telescopes that spotted this new source. So what you see here is what is called an elliptical galaxy, this blob. And then this point here, which is marked by multiple, by these blue lines, this point shows a new source, which was not seen there about 2 days ago. Okay, and this was the emission that resulted from that explosion. So these are all optical images. This is near infrared image. And you can see some of these images, the quality is really poor. Okay, and this is again the limitation of technology. You have a certain number of pixels that you can fit on a camera, and you can choose if you want to have a really sharp image, then each pixel sees a small part of the sky. So you get a highly zoomed in crisp image, or you actually, if you zoom out a lot, then the sources start becoming blurry. Now, as opposed to that, these are images taken by the Hubble Space Telescope, and you can see this galaxy is the same galaxy as what you saw here. You can see this star and these stars here as reference. That star is actually outside, and these are the other stars you were seeing. And here you can actually see the source actually becoming fainter as it was observed over the next week or so. So the event happened on 17th of August. You can see images on 22nd, 26th, and 28th of August at the top. So being in space also means you get rid of all the annoying effects of the Earth's atmosphere, which actually causes things to be blurred. So yeah, clearly we want to be in space. So let's now talk about some Indian space telescopes. Okay, and the most important one is something which was launched about 5 years ago, AstroSat, which is a completely Indian-made space telescope, the first observatory class telescope out there. It actually consists of 5 different telescopes. So we have something called a soft X-ray telescope, which actually manages to focus X-rays, which is quite amazing in itself, technically very challenging. These 3 boxes that you see here are something called a large area X-ray proportional counter. That was the largest X-ray timing instrument ever built. We have a UV and optical telescope sitting at the center. This one here is the cadmium zinc telluride imager. I was part of the team that built this. And then all of these 4 telescopes actually are pointing towards one part of the sky. But these sources at high energy are extremely dynamic. Some of these sources change their brightness by a factor of thousands to even lakhs. So while AstroSat is observing one source up here, what we have on the side is something called the scanning sky monitor, which rotates like this and actually scans the sky along the side continuously. And the way AstroSat observations are done, this can actually map out about half of the sky every day. So it keeps an eye out for any sources that are becoming bright in X-rays. Now, AstroSat is about 5 years old. The goal that we had set for AstroSat was simultaneous multi-wavelength observations of high energy sources. So that's quite a mouthful, right? We have telescopes that can observe in multiple wavelengths, but what is important is that we want simultaneous observations. And this goes back to what I was just saying about the scanning sky monitor, is that these sources keep changing. So you may once image something and think it is a tiger, and next day you go back and look at the same thing and it might be a very docile cat instead. So you want to make sure that all the studies that you are doing are being done simultaneously. So going back to our terrestrial examples, suppose the doctor comes and inspects a patient today who is sitting on bed number A, and then comes tomorrow and takes the patient from bed number A for an X-ray. We have to make sure it is indeed the same patient. If we are continuously changing, then observations of all sorts have to be done together. So that's the key thing with AstroSat. Now, what wavelengths does AstroSat observe at? So here's the electromagnetic spectrum again. This time it's plotted the other way around. So I have radio waves on the left, microwave over here going through infrared, visible, ultraviolet, X-rays and gamma rays. And what is also shown here is representative size scales of what are the things that have roughly that size. Okay, and in this, the different telescopes in AstroSat actually cover multiple bands spanning about 5 orders of magnitude in wavelength. Okay, so going from close to 10 raised to -5 to a fraction of 10 raised to -10. And this entire coverage means that we can actually start understanding the details of those astrophysical objects in very, very high fidelity. So here is what AstroSat actually brought about. So what is plotted here on the x-axis, okay, so this is soft X-rays at 1 keV, and this is 100 keV. To give you context, the baggage scanners at airports operate somewhere in this energy range, so 40 to 60 keV or so. Similarly, medical X-rays are in the same energy range. Okay, and what is plotted on the y-axis is sensitivity. So you can see LAX-PC nicely sits at the top of all of these. There are proposed missions which may be more sensitive. On the soft X-ray side, SXT again from AstroSat is extremely sensitive as well. And where LAX-PC drops off at even higher energy, CZTI takes over. So from this energy to this energy, AstroSat completely rules the sensitivity. It's not just that, it's simultaneous observations spanning visible, ultraviolet, X-rays and gamma rays, as I just talked about. And that I'll be happy to discuss more detailed physics of these objects if anyone is interested later. but right now I'll just stick at this. And then AstroSat also can observe variability at all time scales. So the fastest instruments on AstroSat sample every 20 microseconds, every 10 microseconds in fact. So what we can do is that, so imagine a black hole, if you may, and stuff is falling into that black hole. It is not going to be a uniform flow. There is going to be turbulence. There are going to be all sorts of variations in what is falling in. And that turbulence actually tells us about the local characteristics. So what we can do is that we can actually observe these kind of black hole sources and look at their variability at rates of kilohertz and try to understand what is happening in the innermost parts very close to that black hole. On the other hand, if you have very large black holes, the ones present in the center of our galaxy is about 4 million times the mass of our sun. Now, these often vary at timescales of days, and then some active galactic nuclei even vary at timescales of years. So starting from few microseconds all the way to timescales of 5 years that AstroSat has been on, we have actually studied variability at all of these timescales. And then finally, SSM is continuous monitoring of the X-ray sky. So if something interesting happens in the sky, then we have a very, very good chance of catching it. Why do I say very good and not 100%? Two reasons. One is SSM is looking only at one side of the satellite. And the second is that AstroSat is actually in a low Earth orbit. The Earth's radius is about 6,500 kilometers. AstroSat is 650 kilometers above the surface of Earth, which means that about 1/3 of the sky is just blocked by the ground below AstroSat. Just as if you go out and stand out tonight, you will see less than half of the sky, not even half, because your horizon is not perfectly flat. If you are on an ocean, you would see a bit more than half the sky at best. Now, AstroSat has been highly successful. More than 100 research papers have already been published. There's in fact a special issue coming out for a journal which has another 30 or so papers from AstroSat data. So this number will change sometime in the next 2 weeks, and it will change quite drastically. Let me tell you some fun stories about AstroSat. Okay, and the first one that I want to start with is actually the launch of AstroSat. So this was the second mission that I was working on, but the first one had actually been launched like a missile from a plane. So we never went to see launch. So I was very excited. We went to Sriharikota, and only the PIs of the instruments were actually taken to the launch center, which you see on TV. Okay, and then of course there you see very nice close-up views and so on, but the launch center itself is about 2 kilometers or so away. And we, not being in the VIP category, we were actually about 8 to 10 kilometers away from the launch site. Okay, so here's our view of the launch. This is a cell phone video, and you're not going to hear the audio. So, but what's happening here is the countdown. So I'll try to count along as we proceed, and you'll see the key countdown written on the screen. So we have 4, 3, 2, 1, and this is 0, and the person just continued counting, +3, +4, +5. There's nothing happening here. And that's because the rocket has lifted off, but we will start seeing it only about now. So for about a period of 12 seconds, we were just worried about what exactly is going on here. Why is it that we are not actually seeing the rocket go up? And by the time the rocket went to this height, which was about 30 seconds after launch, we had still not heard it. So the first time we heard the rocket was about 30 seconds later, because that's how it took. So now we started hearing the rocket. So finally, what we did, of course, was we went back from the terrace into the auditorium below the terrace, and there we saw the same high resolution views that everyone was seeing on TV. After launch itself, so this launch happened on 28th of September, and then it takes a week or so. We wait for any volatiles to completely evaporate from the satellite. We wait for it to achieve thermal equilibrium. And then the first instrument that was switched on was our instrument, the cadmium zinc telluride imager. And we pointed at the brightest source in the sky. Okay, and it's the Crab pulsar or Crab nebula is the brightest source in the X-ray sky. And here's the image. This is not actually the image of the crab. We didn't save it, but it looked very much like this. And you'll notice there's a problem here. There is no obvious source. Okay, and that actually did get us worried, saying you are pointing to the brightest source in the sky, and all you are seeing is this is equivalent of the old static noise that you would see on TVs before set-top boxes, right? And but that's not it. The imaging technique is very, very different. So here is what was going on. Okay, so this is a representative thing. I have the source on the right. The green box is the satellite which is going around Earth. And as the satellite goes around Earth, we are pointing continuously to the right, trying to observe the Crab Nebula. Okay, on the left side, not completely the gray box, of course, but on the leftmost side, the source would actually be hidden behind Earth as seen from the satellite, so we would not be able to see it. Okay, so when we say about one orbit, just over half of it is the best time that we can actually observe a source. Okay, but in addition to that, there's a second problem. Okay, it's called the South Atlantic anomalies. So over Brazil and the Southern Atlantic Ocean is a tangled mess of Earth's magnetic fields, and in that region, the Van Allen radiation belts actually come closer to the surface of the Earth. Charged particles actually can come closer to the surface of the Earth. So at altitude of 650 kilometers, the spacecraft is bombarded with charged particles, and these are not good for electronics. So what is done is that, especially if you have high voltage, and I'll come back to high voltage issues later, you actually switch off those elements of the satellite. Okay, now this was the first time this was orbit number 120 or so, first time we were actually switching on the instrument. So instead of switching it off in this part, we were being ultra conservative and we switched off the satellite somewhere here and we switched it on here. Now this switching off and on was happening autonomously. We had not proactively thought about it when the data was being downloaded. So half of the orbit, when the satellite was actually trying to observe, the source was behind Earth. The other half, we had switched off the satellite. So first few orbits, we got nothing. Fortunately, the Earth rotates. So we do about 14 orbits per day. So in another 3-4 orbits, the SA was here, and we got enough data on the source, and we actually saw the source. So I'll show you the image, but when problems like this happen, we actually start wondering, it's time to face reality. We are not exactly rocket scientists. But then finally we sit down, we try to figure things out. We looked at the data. Everyone was crowded around a single computer wondering what is going on. But in the end, we did manage to figure it out. We did manage to get that rocket fly. So this is, by the way, this rocket, this comic is many years old, and a group recently actually made a rocket that looked like that and made it fly. So engineers can get things done, right? So here's the image that we finally got. The image quality has improved significantly since, but here is a bright source right at the center. This was observed on the 6th of October 2015. We gave a nice press release. The next day, we actually got, actually the same day, but we analyzed the data on the next day. We had also discovered what is called a gamma ray burst. So it was a massive star that exploded and was an extremely bright explosion that was seen all the way across the universe. So we have had great results. This GRB was the first scientific result ever published from AstroSat, and it was published within a week of the instruments being switched on. All right. Learning from all of our experiences on AstroSat, going forward, we have actually proposed a very, very ambitious mission called Daksha. So Daksha is a project that's aiming to detect these gravitational wave counterparts that I talked about before. I showed you that animation of two neutron stars colliding. What has happened is that the current satellites that we have all around, there's a mission called SWIFT, which is a US mission. There's another one called Fermi, which is a NASA plus ESA mission, European and this. None of them are actually sensitive enough to detect all of these bursts. So what we are proposing is a set of 2 satellites that will study these explosive transient sources in the universe. And it's going to be broadband, not covering optical, but X-rays to gamma rays. And we will have 2 satellites because for any given satellite, as I said, if the satellite is here and the Earth is here, this part of the sky is actually hidden. So when you have 2 satellites, you put them on opposite sides of the Earth so that you are continuously covering the entire sky. And Daksha is going to be an order of magnitude more sensitive for these transients as compared to any satellite ever launched by anyone in the world. So that's why it is a very big deal, a very, very ambitious mission. Why do we want to do this? Well, so far, that first event that I talked about, the event on 17th of August 2017, that's the only one where we have actually seen X-rays, gamma rays, or any kind of electromagnetic radiation from a neutron star merger. Theoretical models tell us that there should be many, many more. And with Daksha, we will be able to see 10 to 20 such events per year. So in a nominal 5-year mission span, we will detect between 50 to 100 events, as opposed to the current score where we in the last 3 years have seen only one. The second thing is that this, I mentioned a gamma ray burst, like the one we saw when AstroSat was first switched on. All the satellites in the world put together currently detect about 350 of them per year. So roughly one a day. With Daksha, we will actually be able to see about 1,000 per year. So within about 2 to 3 years after launch, we will have detected more GRBs than anyone else ever before. And by the time the mission is complete, we will have detected more GRBs even than all missions put together as compared to what came before us. And then a last part is something very interesting, which is that we are so sensitive, we can tell the gravitational wave detector folks like LIGO, hey, go look there. We just saw something and you should see something there as well. And that allows us to actually change some search parameters, improve the signal to noise ratio, and we might improve the sensitivity of LIGO itself by a factor of 2 to 3. Something this large, of course, can't be made at a single place. So this is being a project being led by IIT Bombay. We have a team from departments of physics, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering. I'm the only one among them who's jumping between astronomy and engineering. Some of them are completely physicists, others are fully engineers. And then we have a partnership with PRL Ahmedabad, TIFR Mumbai, RRI Bangalore, Ayuka Pune, and various ISRO institutes. We've been given seed funding. We are working on demonstrating a proof of concept. So hopefully by this time next year, we will have full approval and full funding for the mission. Okay, that brings me to the last part of my talk, which is how do we actually build stuff for space? Before I embark on this, let me ask Professor Suresh, roughly how much time do I have? Sorry, I see you speaking, but you are muted.
Yeah, you can take another 10-15 minutes if you want. I mean,
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go behind the scenes for Daksha. Okay, so what you saw as a basic rendering, here's a more broken up CAD for the entire thing. So what we have is we have a total of 34 detector units and close to 500 individual detectors that will sit on the satellite. And we have to create something that is extremely strong, extremely lightweight, easy to assemble. So that's the mechanical challenge. And let's look at just one basic component from this. Okay, so this at the bottom is what we call the base plate. So this plate is holding a bunch of detectors at the center, gamma ray detectors. Remember, gamma rays go through everything, so we don't need to put those detectors on the surface. And this plate itself, now we have to actually make it ready for space-worthy launches. Okay, because this entire thing is integrated as one payload, we can only bolt this down from the sides, and that actually is bringing a unique challenge, which is, so this is the design of the base plate, and I can only bolt it down along the edges. Okay, and if you have something that is bolted along the edges and free at the center, that's pretty much exactly what a drum is. So if you actually now look at what will happen during launch, so I was actually looking for nice recent rocket launch videos, and turns out that everyone has started putting highly stabilized video cameras, so you no longer see the vibration. But if you look at movies, on the other hand, they exaggerate the launch vibrations because they want to show the heroics of their actors and actresses. In reality, launch is really bad. You can pull several Gs of forces and the whole thing shakes like crazy. So we have to make sure that whatever we are building is not actually going to rip itself apart by vibrations. Now, if we have this basic base plate design, turns out that the thing actually has its fundamental mode exactly like a drum. And the frequency is about 40 hertz. I tried to put a video here, but we discovered that the sound is not going through. but this is a 40-inch gong that is being played here, which is about the same size as the base plate. Okay, and this was put here just to give you an idea that that's exactly what happens. So in order to avoid those vibrations, solution one is to make the plate really, really thick, but that makes it extremely heavy. And you don't want that. Launching anything is extremely expensive, so your satellite has to be as lightweight as possible. Now, there are fortunately standard solutions for this, and the solution in this case is actually derived from nature. So it has been mathematically shown that a honeycomb structure is actually among the best in terms of your weight to strength ratio. And these kind of aluminum honeycomb panels are what we actually use for making the base plate. So we did this full slew of simulations. And if you make the base plate out of such a honeycomb panel, then the vibration frequencies actually become high enough that, and the vibration amplitude becomes low enough that it is acceptable by space standards. And this is about 20 kilograms lighter than having aluminum base plate, which was still not satisfying all the requirements. So the difference that we make is that this kind of ideas make is enormous. There's another interesting anecdote about vibration testing. So when you design something, you find one of the final qualification stages is that you actually want to shake up the model and make sure that nothing is falling apart because you don't want it breaking during launch. And you may have seen this picture. This is actually the photograph of Apple, the first indigenous satellite ever made. And it's been loaded on a bullock cart and is being transported. The anecdote goes that this is how we did vibration testing. That anecdote is not true, but the image is real. What was done was that they did not have a truck of the appropriate size to actually transport the satellite. It had already gone through vibration testing. So they took a clean box, put it on a bullock cart because that is what was readily available there. And then, of course, also used the opportunity for a nice photograph that became immortal by itself. Here's another part. Okay, we usually think of space as being extremely cold, but what do we mean by cold? So if I'm sitting here, when I say temperature, I'm usually talking about the temperature of the air in the room. And in space, there's vacuum. So defining temperature itself is tricky. So let's imagine that I have my satellite floating here, and it has detectors, it's consuming power, so it's going to generate its own heat, but we would think that it is going to radiate away all of that heat and cool down very quickly and reach extremely low temperatures. We have to consider that again. So the satellite is orbiting around the Earth, and the Earth itself is being heated up by the sun. So remember, we have this nice comfortable weather around us, and that is completely coming from sunlight. The greenhouse gases help, but they raise the temperature only by about 30 degrees or so, which means that the average temperature of anything that is orbiting Earth should remain close to 0 degrees. But then when we are actually generating our own heat on top of that, the design can become really, really tricky. And another part is that the satellite is going around Earth, it is getting radiation from Earth as well. When it goes in the Earth's shadow on this side, it suddenly starts becoming very cold. When it is here, it is receiving radiation from the sun and from the Earth, it becomes very hot. So we said, okay, let's design this and test this. So this is a thermal simulation that we did, satellite orbiting around Earth, simulate all the loads and everything. And take one made us think that we should take back the entire idea. So let me mark out things on this graph here. First is you see these swings, okay? We started assuming it was 20 degrees, but these swings that you see are coming from orbit to orbit variation. So this is cold when it is in the shadow of the Earth, hot when it is between the Earth and the sun. The peak temperature actually reached about 78 degrees Celsius. And the difference between the hottest and the coldest point on the satellite was about 35 degrees. And the swing during the orbit was almost 20 degrees. Now, imagine you are building any electronic instruments, they don't work nicely at high temperature. Okay, you want electronics to be cooled down, especially if you want high sensitivity, low noise performance. Starting from here, of course, we have proceeded a lot. I have not put the later set of simulations, but now we have managed to bring the entire satellite temperature between 0 to 20 degrees. So let me end with a last anecdote. So the first mission that I worked on during my PhD was the satellite called NuSTAR. Okay, so this satellite itself is about 10 meters long. There are optical benches here. detectors sitting over here. This was deployed in very fancy mechanism in space. But what I'm going to focus on is this part, which houses the detectors. So let me give you the ABCD of the detectors. We have an aperture stop, a beryllium window, some shielding to protect the detectors from radiation, and the detectors are sitting in here. And then finally, there are control electronics at the bottom. Now, this entire thing in the design process before launching, we have to actually test it in a space-like environment. So we have to do the thermal cycling, like the graphs that you just saw, while the thing is put in complete vacuum. So as the only grad student working on this thermovac test, naturally the job was completely mine to sit there and do this test, which lasted for about 2 weeks. I wasn't sitting alone, of course, there were others. So here's the equipment actually being loaded into a thermal and vacuum testing chamber. Here's the team. This is the PI, my guide, Fiona Harrison. Rick Cook has been designing electronics for 50 years now. For his PhD thesis, he built instruments for the Voyager, and he proudly says that all his instruments are still working. And what's not seen fully in this photograph is a set of 4 computer monitors, which had very small icons, about 100 of them. And my job was that me plus any one of these people, whoever is available, would sit here in this room and keep an eye out for all the signals coming from the instrument. A lot of things were not even connected, so most of the lights used to be red. And then everything was going fine. We were actually in the last day of this 14-15 day thermovac test when a worrying symptom popped up. And the symptom was hard to catch. Okay, out of the 100 signals or so that we were seeing, one light went from green to red. And it said that a certain current was actually getting high and was getting stuck at a high value. So I went and told Fiona quite casually, oh, by the way, one new signal has come up, and she's like, oh dear, that one is not supposed to go high. So what was happening was that this is a phenomenon called arcing or coronal discharge. Okay, this is how neon lights work. So pure vacuum, if you hold 2 terminals of high voltage, you don't see any arcing. Electrical engineers will also know that in air, breakdown is difficult. You need very, very high voltage in air to induce a breakdown. But if you have low pressure air, then arcing is very, very easy. That's actually how all of these lamps work. Now, what was diagnosed was that in this setup over here, okay, you see there are tapes that are wrapped around here. Now, there was an air bubble in one of these tapes, and in the thermal and vacuum cycling, the final stage that we were going through, we had gone to a temperature of -50 and kept the instrument at -50 overnight. So the tape became brittle. When we started ramping the temperature up, the metallic components, of course, heated faster. The air in that air bubble started expanding because of that. The tape was brittle, so it popped and the air bubble started expanding. And right next to that bubble was a high voltage source. So now you have exactly the conditions that you don't want in this scenario. And you can see there are these small burn marks over here. So this was the later diagnosis that was done. And this very, very small oversight about how a sellotape had been wrapped around that made this entire difference. That is also why we take a lot of precautions in doing these testing. So what you see here is a stack of binders, and you see one of them open here. This is half the stack of what we actually filled up in terms of paperwork in those 2 weeks of tests. So the procedures were carefully thought out, written down, and then finally we actually managed to find and debug these issues. So I'll end with that, and we can take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Varun. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
I'm looking at a few questions here. The first question is actually for me, or INAE rather. Okay. When will today's recording be made available, etc.? So this will not be made available on YouTube, as I understand. It will be made available on the INAE website. And usually that takes about 10 to 15 days, but it might take a little longer this time because there are a number of events in the last 3 days. And INAE headquarters will be working overtime, putting up all those things on the website. So that's the short answer to that. The next question is from Sanat Kumar. He says, maybe a bit away from topic, a few words about Earthbound 30-meter telescope. What is its aim? What is India's contribution to it? What is the present status in this project?
Okay, so the largest existing ground-based telescopes have mirrors which are about 10 meters in size. To give you context, if I took, so the normal large telescopes that you and I are likely to see if we go for a stargazing session typically have, so these telescopes use mirrors instead of lenses and there are about this size. Uh, 10 meter means that if I made that mirror stand over on its side, it would be about 3 floors tall. Uh, but that is not sensitive enough to show us the objects that are furthest away. That is not, so the idea behind the mirror is to gather more and more light and be able to study fainter objects. So if we want to study things at the very birth of the universe, if we want to study the highest redshift galaxies, or if we want to study close by objects in greater detail, neutron stars, for example, emit very little in optical, but they do emit optical light. So if we want to study them, we need a large telescope. So it's that kind of a set of goals. There's actually a nice large document, few hundred pages, that discusses these entire science goals of the 30-meter telescope. The telescope itself is going to be built in Hawaii, and India is a 10% partner. So there are 3 projects around the world to build 30-meter class telescopes. India actually set up a committee. This was about 10 or 8 years ago that went and met all 3 teams and looked at what they were doing. And we decided that the 30-meter telescope was actually the most suitable project for us. So that's the team we joined. Um, we are actually contributing about 70% of our contribution is in kind. So we are doing a lot of hardware and software development for it. In terms of software, we are writing the entire telescope control system, the proposal management systems. In terms of hardware, we are actually building the mirror supports themselves. Okay, so the primary thing that holds up all of these mirrors, those things are being built in the Indian Institute of Astrophysics in Bangalore. Uh, Overall status of the project, there have been some hiccups due to some political unrest in Hawaii. I'm not aware if it has been fully resolved, but overall it was quite close to being resolved the last I knew.
Thanks, Varun. I have a question. There's one that has appeared, but just before I take that up, compared to the Hubble telescope, which is now what, about 25 years old, 25, 30 years old, is the technology very different in today's space telescopes?
Yes and no. Hubble was built in, so in terms of the primary design of the telescope itself, the fundamental telescope design hasn't changed for decades.
Yeah.
But so that is why the no part. The instruments that we build today are far, far more sophisticated and sensitive as compared to the instruments that were originally launched with the Hubble. The new telescope that is being launched to replace Hubble is called James Webb Space Telescope. And James Webb Space Telescope, actually, the mirror is so large that it's going to be folded at launch and is going to be deployed in space. So, and it doesn't even have a closed tube like Hubble. So, in terms of engineering designs, it's quite a different thing. It is also going to work in the infrared. So, there is a lot of technology that has gone in to keep it very cold, passively very cool at cryogenic temperatures.
Okay. Thanks. There's a question from Dr. Ramkumar Singh. Before launch, what major calibrations are made for the space telescope? Further, is there any practice to check the calibration in space?
Yes. So great question. The answer to both is yes. So first, okay, so we have something called technology readiness levels, which is adopted in several fields. So we start from TRL1, which is a proof of concept, and we slowly march up as we qualify more things. So first we have to develop and demonstrate what is called a breadboard model. If it is electronics or in mechanical thing, we have to show that we can actually make the component. Then we do basic functional testing in the laboratory. So for a telescope, we will actually use artificial sources in the lab to make sure that the sensitivity, energy resolution, image quality, and so on are all correct. Then after that, we go through thermal cycling, we go through vacuum testing as we go progressively higher up the ladder. Vibration tests are usually done at the end. And often what is also done is that we vibrate and shake a different model because we test it to conditions which are more extreme than ones you are likely to actually face in space. and that causes fatigue on your instrument itself. So you then, if instrument A qualifies, then you build instrument B with identical parameters and actually launch that. So that is often the practice that is done. There too, you will still go through some basic qualification and testing. And then finally, once we have launched, we actually do a series of in-orbit calibration. So on the ground, I said we would have checked the image quality, we would have checked the sensitivity. Then you look at standard astrophysical sources whose properties are known, and then you compare against those, saying that source is supposed to look like this. Does it actually look like this to my telescope? And there are large international collaborations. For example, there's a collaboration called IHEC. There was actually a seminar around right now by IHEC, which talks about comparing the data quality from different telescopes. Because when you build highly sensitive instruments, you don't even know what a source is supposed to look like exactly. So there's a lot of mathematical trickery that you have to do in order to make those results work together.
Suresh, I have a question. Can I put?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it was a nice talk. Varun, I was
Thank
just
you.
checking who all gives you the idea about your radiation shielding? Because for the material quality maintenance, you have to do a proper shielding. So
Yes.
who does that work?
So we usually handle this in two parts. First is that we shield, active shielding is done only for the detectors. Something which we call active shielding means that we have a shield which will tell us when radiation was incident on it. That is done only for the sensitive elements. The electronic components themselves, they are certified by vendors and then recertified by ISRO to be radiation hardened. So we simply follow the norms that are set by ISRO. The testing is usually done in particle beamlines on the ground to actually show that the chips that we use are going to be tolerant to those doses of radiation. For non-testable components, there are design norms that have been set by now. For example, circuit boards themselves, the track widths and track spacing and so on are larger than what you would use on ground boards because you want to be resistant to any kind of in-orbit damage.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I think I don't see any more questions.
Sir, there are
Yeah.
two more questions in chat box, sir.
Okay, let me just check that. Okay. What is the pointing accuracy and stability requirement of the telescope?
That varies drastically from telescope to telescope. So for example, in case of AstroSat, the stability is of the order of an arc minute, which is about a 60th of a degree. But so that is the pointing accuracy itself. The pointing knowledge is much better. So what is done is AstroSat is that one of the telescopes, the optical telescope takes images at a very high rate and we track the motion of stars and we correct for that in ground processing. In case of a satellite like Daksha, the position accuracy of sources is going to be order of degrees and follow-up telescopes will do better. So there our pointing and stability requirements are much less than that. So there we need a pointing accuracy of about 0.1 degrees to 0.2 degrees is good enough for us. The knowledge, of course, in all of these cases is done using star trackers and that is obtained quite accurately. Often to arc seconds is plausible by doing that.
Thank you. I think that is all we have in terms of questions. Let me just check once more. Yeah, there's one more. Any future potential for studies on dwarf stars with these telescopes?
Yes, there is. There are dwarf stars, for example, white dwarfs or even what we call regular dwarfs, red dwarfs and so on, are being studied with AstroSat. There are several papers that have been published about them. With Daksha itself, the goal is very specifically different. So we will not be studying regular white dwarfs and so on with Daksha. We may detect something called CV outbursts or novae. But on the other hand, other telescopes that are being proposed, so there is one being launched soon called Polix, which is a project which was led by, or Exposat, a project led by the Raman Research Institute. This is a completely Indian mission again. Launch is expected in about 3 months from now. and they will also be studying neutron stars and white dwarfs.
Thank you. The one final question here. What sort of electrical power and voltage ratings are required for space telescopes? I guess.
That's a great question. So solar panels typically give us about 35 volts or so, so 35 volts of unregulated voltage. What we often do is that electronics, because we are using the same set of components, the standard voltages that are used, of course, will vary from instrument to instrument, but standards are very similar. So you would find devices working at 12 volts, 5 volts, 3.5 volts. The power requirements can vary a lot. Daksha, for instance, is rather power hungry. We will need about 600 watts of power. Astrosat consumes a bit less. If you have CubeSats on the other hand, for example, the IIT Bombay student satellite team is working on something called Advitiya, which will work on a few watts of power. So on the lowest end, these CubeSats, which are literally this size, 10 centimeter cubes, they can work on very low power. Very large telescopes can go into kilowatts.
Thank you. I think that's all we have in terms of questions. And thank you from my side for a great talk. And I will hand over to Dr. Shashwati Roy for a final formal vote of thanks.
I must thank Varun for this excellent lecture. And the way he has presented it, it is not remained only for the physicist. All of us could understand it very well. So a great thanks to him. Especially when you have given the example of your cat and tiger, that comparison, that will be there in everybody's mind, that how simultaneous observations are, how important for so many persons to do the work and then to become a co-worker or the co-writer of the paper. Thanks again for this vast journey. I also thank to all the audience for being with us in this time. And special thank to Professor Suresh. He is our co-coordinator, so co-convener of the chapter. So anyway, he has to take all the pain. Especially, again, we thank to our INE head office and Rahul especially, because for all the time, whatever problems we have, we call him and get all the supports. So with that, I end today's talk. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for this wonderful lecture, ma'am.
Thank you. All the best.